My name is Antonio, and I'm about to tell you the most painful story of my life. How one moment of pride and stupidity started a war that claimed over 80 lives and turned Compton into a battlefield for 3 years. I was a Fruittown PIRU blood, and what I did on a hot summer night in 1998 changed everything. Not just for me, but for every family in Compton who lost someone in the violence that followed. If you think you understand what real consequences look like, if you think one decision can't destroy an entire community, you're about to learn why sometimes the smallest spark can create the biggest fire. The war I started wasn't planned, it wasn't strategic, and it definitely wasn't smart. It happened because I was 19 years old, full of rage, and too proud to walk away from disrespect. But what haunts me every single night isn't just the war itself, it's how it ended, and what I had to do to stop the monster I had created. Stay with me until the end, because what happened after 3 years of bloodshed will shock you more than the war itself. Before we go any deeper, let me be absolutely clear about why I'm sharing this story. I'm not here to glorify gang violence or make myself sound like some kind of legend. I'm here to warn you about how quickly things can spiral out of control when pride becomes more important than common sense. For 5 years, I was an active member of the Fruittown PIRU Bloods in Compton, California. We controlled territory from Rosecrans Avenue to Alondra Boulevard, and our main rivals were the Southside Crips and various other Crip sets throughout the city. I thought I understood gang warfare, the rules, the boundaries, the unwritten codes that kept conflicts from getting too out of hand. I was wrong about everything. The war I started broke every rule, crossed every boundary, and destroyed every code that had kept Compton's gang violence somewhat contained. What I'm about to tell you isn't a story about heroism or brotherhood. It's a story about how one man's ego can become a community's nightmare. Every word I'm about to speak is the truth, no matter how painful it is to admit. I grew up in Compton during the height of the crack epidemic, when gang colors meant everything and the wrong street could get you killed. My father was never around, and my mother worked 3 jobs just to keep us in a tiny apartment near the Compton courthouse. The Fruittown PIRU Bloods weren't just a gang in our neighborhood. They were the neighborhood. They provided protection, identity, and most importantly for a kid like me, they offered respect in a world where respect was the only currency that mattered. I joined when I was 14, went through the usual initiation, and spent the next 5 years learning how to survive in a world where violence was as common as breathing. By 19, I had earned my stripes through multiple conflicts with rival sets, drug operations, and the kind of street credibility that made people step aside when I walked down the block. I thought I was untouchable, that my reputation would protect me from any serious consequences. I had no idea that reputation would become the very thing that destroyed everything I cared about. The streets taught me to value respect above everything else, including life itself. The Fruittown PIRU Bloods had a reputation for being one of the most disciplined sets in Compton. We weren't the biggest or the most violent, but we were strategic, organized, and respected by both allies and enemies. Our territory was relatively small but highly profitable, centered around several key drug corners that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue every month. I'd worked my way up from a young soldier to a trusted lieutenant, someone who was consulted on major decisions and given responsibility for important operations. The older OGs saw potential in me. I was smart, ruthless when necessary, but also capable of thinking strategically rather than just reacting emotionally to every slight or challenge. They were grooming me for leadership, teaching me the complex politics of gang alliances, territorial agreements, and the delicate balance that kept large-scale wars from erupting. I thought I was learning how to be a leader, but I was actually learning how to be a weapon. The difference between those two things would become clear on the night that changed everything. The summer of 1998 was particularly tense in Compton. Several high-profile incidents between different sets had everyone on edge, and there was a feeling in the air that something big was about to happen. The police had increased their presence in response to a series of drive-by shootings, which made normal gang operations more difficult and increased the pressure on everyone involved. Tempers were running high, and even minor incidents were escalating into serious conflicts. The Southside Crips, our main rivals, had been testing our boundaries for weeks, driving through our territory, tagging over our graffiti, making it clear that they were looking for an excuse to start something. The older OGs counseled patience, reminding us that wars were expensive, unpredictable, and bad for business. They had lived through previous conflicts and understood the true cost of large-scale violence. But the younger members, myself included, were getting frustrated with what we saw as weakness. We wanted to respond decisively to every challenge, to show the Southside Crips that we wouldn't tolerate any disrespect. That frustration was building toward an explosion, and I was about to provide the spark that would ignite it. The night that changed everything started like any other Friday in Compton. I was hanging out with my crew at our usual spot near the corner of Rosecrans and Central, just talking trash and watching the neighborhood. Around 11 p.m., a car full of Southside Crips drove slowly past our corner, music loud, windows down, clearly trying to provoke a reaction. This kind of thing happened all the time. Rival gangs testing boundaries, showing disrespect, seeing how far they could push before someone responded. Usually we would just stare them down, maybe throw up our set, and let them keep driving. The unwritten rule was that unless someone got out of the car or actually threatened violence, these little displays of disrespect were just part of the game. But that night was different. That night, one of the Crips in the passenger seat decided to take things further. As their car passed our corner, he threw a bottle that shattered right at my feet, covering my shoes with glass and beer. Then he yelled something that I won't repeat here, but it was the kind of disrespect that couldn't be ignored without losing face in front of my own crew. The bottle wasn't just glass and beer, it was a direct challenge to my authority and my manhood. In that moment, I had a choice that would define the rest of my life and the lives of dozens of other people. I could let it slide, chalk it up to typical gang posturing, and go home to fight another day. Or I could respond with the kind of violence that would send a message to every rival set in Compton that Fruittown PIRU was not to be disrespected. The smart choice was obvious. One bottle and some words weren't worth starting a war over. But I was 19 years old, full of adrenaline, and surrounded by my crew, who were all looking at me to see how I would handle this challenge to my authority. Pride won over wisdom, and I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I pulled out my gun, aimed at their car as it drove away, and emptied the entire clip. The sound of gunfire echoed through the neighborhood like thunder, and I watched their car swerve, crash into a parked vehicle, and come to a stop about 50 yards down the street. What I didn't know in that moment was that my bullets had found their target. Not just the gang member who had disrespected me, but also his 14-year-old cousin who had been sitting in the back seat, just along for the ride. That child's death would become the catalyst for 3 years of unimaginable violence. The aftermath of that shooting was immediate and devastating. Within hours, word had spread throughout Compton that Fruittown PIRU had killed a Southside Crip and an innocent kid in a drive-by shooting. The Southside Crips demanded immediate retaliation, not just against me, but against anyone associated with Fruittown PIRU. What should have been a simple conflict between two individuals became a declaration of war between two of the most powerful gangs in Compton. The next morning, 3 Fruittown members were shot while walking to the store. That afternoon, we retaliated by shooting up a house where Southside Crips were known to hang out. By the end of the week, 6 people were dead, and the violence was escalating faster than anyone could control. I had started something that was taking on a life of its own, spreading beyond the original participants and consuming innocent people who had nothing to do with the initial conflict. The 14-year-old boy I had killed became a symbol for the Southside Crips, and his death gave them the moral justification they needed to wage total war against our set. His face was on T-shirts, his name was spray-painted on walls, and his memory became a rallying cry for revenge that would fuel violence for years to come. The war that followed was unlike anything Compton had ever seen. For 3 years, from 1998 to 2001, the conflict between Fruittown PIRU and Southside Crips turned entire neighborhoods into war zones. Drive-by shootings became daily occurrences, innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire, and families were forced to move out of the area just to keep their children safe. The violence wasn't contained to gang members. It spilled over into schools, shopping centers, community events, anywhere members of rival sets might encounter each other. I watched my neighborhood transform from a place where people could walk the streets safely into a battlefield, where children had to crawl on the floor to avoid stray bullets. The guilt was overwhelming, but I couldn't show weakness. In the gang world, admitting that you started something you couldn't finish is seen as the ultimate sign of cowardice, and cowards don't survive long in that environment. So I kept fighting, kept retaliating, kept escalating the violence, even as it consumed everything I cared about. Every funeral I attended, every hospital visit I made, every family that was destroyed, all of it was my fault. But I was trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. By the second year of the war, the death toll had reached over 40 people, and the violence was attracting national attention. News crews were camping out in Compton, documenting the daily shootings and interviewing families who had lost loved ones to the conflict. The police response was overwhelming. Task forces, federal investigations, and a level of surveillance that made normal gang operations almost impossible. But the war had developed its own momentum, and neither side could back down without losing face. Every funeral became a recruitment opportunity. Every death demanded retaliation, and every act of violence created new enemies who would carry the conflict forward, even if the original participants wanted to stop. I realized that I had created a monster that was beyond my control, a cycle of violence that would continue long after I was dead or imprisoned. The worst part was seeing how the war was affecting people who had nothing to do with gangs. Elderly residents who couldn't leave their homes, children who couldn't play outside, businesses that closed because customers were afraid to shop in the area. The entire community was being held hostage by a conflict that had started with a broken bottle and wounded pride. The violence escalated to levels that shocked even hardened gang members. What had started as drive-by shootings evolved into coordinated attacks, ambushes, and even bombings. Both sides began recruiting from other sets, turning a local conflict into a regional war that drew in gangs from across Los Angeles County. The Southside Crips formed alliances with other Crip sets, while we reached out to blood sets throughout the area for support and reinforcements. The war was no longer about the original incident. It had become about survival, territory, and the kind of deep-seated hatred that develops when too much blood has been spilled to ever forgive or forget. I found myself planning operations that I never could have imagined before the war started, targeting not just enemy gang members, but their families, their businesses, anyone or anything connected to the Southside Crips. The line between combatant and civilian had completely disappeared, and innocent people were dying simply because they lived in the wrong neighborhood or had the wrong last name. The monster I had created was consuming everything in its path, and I was powerless to stop it. The psychological toll of the war was devastating for everyone involved. I stopped sleeping, started using drugs to numb the guilt and fear, and became increasingly paranoid about potential attacks. Every car that drove too slowly past our territory could be an enemy. Every stranger on the street could be a threat. Every phone call could be news of another death. The constant stress was breaking down my mental health, but I couldn't seek help without appearing weak to my own crew. I watched friends and family members develop the same symptoms: insomnia, paranoia, substance abuse, depression, as the war consumed not just our bodies, but our minds and souls. Children in the neighborhood started showing signs of trauma, elderly residents developed anxiety disorders, and the entire community began to suffer from a collective form of post-traumatic stress. The war had become a cancer that was metastasizing throughout Compton, destroying the social fabric that held the community together. I began to understand that what I had started wasn't just a gang conflict. It was a community-wide disaster that would have lasting effects for generations. The breaking point came during the third year of the war, when my own little sister was shot in a case of mistaken identity. She was walking home from school when a car full of Southside Crips spotted her wearing a red backpack and assumed she was affiliated with our set. The bullets that were meant for me found her instead, and she spent 3 months in the hospital fighting for her life. Sitting in that hospital room, watching my sister struggle to breathe because of a war I had started over a broken bottle and some disrespectful words, I finally understood the true cost of my pride. This wasn't about gang loyalty or street credibility anymore. This was about innocent people paying the price for my stupidity. That night, I made a decision that would shock everyone who knew me. I was going to end the war, even if it meant sacrificing my own life to do it. The only way to stop the cycle of violence was for someone to break it, and since I had started it, I was the only one who could end it. My sister's blood was on my hands just as much as everyone else's, and I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try to stop the madness I had created. The decision to end the war was the hardest thing I had ever contemplated. It meant admitting that everything I had done for 3 years was wrong, that dozens of people had died for nothing, that my pride had been more important to me than human life. It meant facing the families of the victims, acknowledging my role in their pain, and accepting whatever consequences came with that admission. Most terrifyingly, it meant going against everything I had been taught about gang culture, that backing down was weakness, that admitting mistakes was fatal, that wars could only end with total victory or total defeat. But watching my sister fight for her life, because of my choices, had broken something inside me, some fundamental belief in the righteousness of what I was doing. I realized that I had become exactly the kind of person I had joined the gang to protect my community from, someone who brought violence and chaos into the lives of innocent people. The war had to end, and if I was the only one with the power to end it, then that was what I had to do, regardless of the personal cost. Ending a gang war isn't as simple as calling a ceasefire. There were too many people on both sides who had lost family members, too much blood spilled, too many grudges that had developed their own momentum beyond the original conflict. But I had one advantage. I was the person who had started it all, and that gave me a unique form of credibility with both sides. I began reaching out through intermediaries, former gang members who had gotten out of the life and could serve as neutral messengers. The process took months of careful negotiation, secret meetings, and delicate diplomacy that required me to swallow my pride and admit that the war had been a mistake from the beginning. The hardest part was facing the families of people who had died because of the conflict I had started. Mothers who had lost sons, children who had lost fathers, communities that had been torn apart by violence that served no purpose beyond feeding the egos of young men who didn't understand the consequences of their actions. Some of those families wanted nothing to do with peace talks, demanding that I pay with my life for what I had done. Others, incredibly, were willing to listen, recognizing that more violence wouldn't bring back their loved ones. The peace negotiations were unlike anything that had ever been attempted in Compton. We had to create entirely new frameworks for resolving conflicts, establishing neutral territories and preventing future escalations. Both sides had to agree to give up claims for revenge, to stop recruiting new members specifically for the war, and to work together to de-escalate tensions whenever they arose. The process required input from community leaders, former gang members, law enforcement, and even some of the families who had been affected by the violence. Every detail had to be negotiated carefully, from how members of rival sets would interact in public spaces to how disputes would be resolved without resorting to violence. The most difficult aspect was addressing the deep-seated hatred that had developed over 3 years of warfare. People on both sides had lost brothers, sons, fathers, and friends, and that kind of pain doesn't disappear just because someone signs a peace agreement. We had to find ways to honor the memory of the dead, while preventing their deaths from being used to justify future violence. It was the most complex and emotionally challenging process I had ever been involved in, requiring skills and wisdom that I had never developed during my time as a gang member. The peace agreement we finally reached was unlike anything that had ever been attempted in Compton. Both sides agreed to a complete cessation of hostilities, the establishment of neutral zones where members of rival sets could coexist, and most importantly, a commitment to resolving future conflicts through dialogue rather than violence. The agreement required me to publicly acknowledge my role in starting the war and to work actively to prevent future conflicts between the sets. It was humiliating. It destroyed my reputation as a tough guy, and it made me a target for gang members who saw the peace process as a sign of weakness. But it worked. The daily shootings stopped. Families began moving back to the neighborhood, and children could play outside without fear of being caught in crossfire. The war that had claimed over 80 lives finally came to an end, not through victory or defeat, but through the recognition that the violence was destroying the very communities we claimed to be protecting. The peace wasn't perfect, and there were still occasional incidents, but the large-scale warfare that had terrorized Compton for 3 years was finally over. The silence that followed the end of the shooting was almost as shocking as the violence had been. The transition from gang member to peace advocate was the most difficult period of my life. I had to learn how to resolve conflicts without violence, how to command respect through wisdom rather than fear, and how to live with the guilt of knowing that dozens of people had died because of my pride and stupidity. The families of the victims had every right to hate me, and many of them did, but some of them, incredibly, chose to work with me in the peace process, recognizing that their loved ones' deaths would be meaningless unless we could prevent future tragedies. Working with these families taught me more about courage, forgiveness, and real strength than all my years as a gang member combined. They showed me that true power comes from the ability to create rather than destroy, to heal rather than hurt, to build bridges rather than walls. The skills I had developed as a gang member, leadership, strategic thinking, the ability to command respect, could be used for positive purposes if I was willing to change my perspective and my priorities. The transformation wasn't easy, and there were many times when I wanted to give up, but the memory of my sister in that hospital bed kept me focused on the goal of preventing other families from experiencing the same pain. The aftermath of the war left deep scars on the entire Compton community that are still visible today. Families were torn apart, businesses were destroyed, and an entire generation of young people grew up thinking that violence was a normal part of daily life. The economic impact was devastating. Property values plummeted, businesses relocated to safer areas, and the community lost millions of dollars in revenue and investment. The psychological impact was even worse, with rates of depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder skyrocketing among residents who had lived through the 3 years of warfare. Children who had grown up during the war struggled with behavioral problems, academic difficulties, and an inability to trust that the peace would last. The social fabric of the community had been shredded, and rebuilding it required years of dedicated effort from community leaders, social workers, and residents who were committed to healing. I made it my mission to be part of that healing process, working with anyone who would have me to address the damage that my actions had caused. It was the least I could do, though I knew that nothing I did could ever fully repair the harm that had been done. Over the past 20 years since the war ended, I've dedicated my life to preventing gang violence and helping young people find alternatives to the streets. Working with community organizations, schools, and law enforcement agencies, I've shared my story with thousands of at-risk youth across California and beyond. The response has been overwhelming. Young people who are on the verge of joining gangs have changed their minds after hearing about the real cost of that life. Parents have gained new insights into what their children are facing, and even some active gang members have reached out for help resolving conflicts peacefully. The most meaningful moments come when I meet young people who remind me of myself at 19, angry, proud, convinced that violence is the only way to earn respect. When I can show them the true consequences of that mindset, when I can help them understand that real strength comes from walking away from fights rather than starting them, when I can convince them that their lives have value beyond what they can do for a gang, those are the moments that make all the pain and struggle worthwhile. Every young person who chooses a different path is a victory against the forces that tried to destroy my community, and a step toward healing the wounds that I helped create. The work I do now has taken me to schools, community centers, juvenile detention facilities, and even some of the same corners where the war I started played out. I speak to gang members, at-risk youth, parents, teachers, law enforcement officers, and anyone else who will listen about the real consequences of gang violence. The message is always the same. Pride will destroy everything you care about if you let it control your decisions. Violence creates more problems than it solves, and wars are easier to start than to stop. I tell them about the 80-plus people who died because I couldn't walk away from a broken bottle, about the families that were destroyed, about the community that was terrorized for 3 years because of one moment of wounded pride. Some people listen, some people don't, but I keep telling the story because I know that if it prevents even one act of violence, if it saves even one life, then all the pain and humiliation of admitting my mistakes will have been worth it. The work is dangerous because it requires me to maintain connections to the gang world while trying to help people escape from it, but it's also the most meaningful thing I've ever done with my life. If there's one thing I want you to understand from my story, it's that pride is the most dangerous emotion a young person can have. Pride makes you do stupid things. Pride makes you escalate conflicts that could be resolved peacefully. And pride makes you value your reputation more than your life or the lives of people you care about. The war I started in Compton wasn't about territory or money or even respect. It was about my inability to let a moment of disrespect pass without violent retaliation. That one decision, made in a split second of wounded pride, led to 3 years of violence that destroyed families, devastated communities, and claimed over 80 lives. Every person who died in that war died because I was too proud to walk away from a broken bottle and some harsh words. The gang life promises you respect, but the respect you get is built on fear, and fear-based respect disappears the moment you show any weakness. Real respect comes from your character, your integrity, and your ability to make decisions that benefit others rather than just yourself. The respect I have now, earned through years of working to undo the damage I caused, is worth more than all the fear-based respect I ever commanded as a gang member. To the young people watching this who might be facing similar choices, who feel disrespected or threatened, and are considering violent retaliation, I'm begging you to learn from my mistakes. That moment of satisfaction you'll feel from getting revenge isn't worth the lifetime of consequences that will follow. Every act of violence creates ripple effects that you can't control or predict, and those ripples often destroy innocent people who had nothing to do with the original conflict. The person who disrespects you today will be forgotten in a week, but the people who die because of your retaliation will haunt you forever. There are always alternatives to violence. Walking away, getting help from adults, using the legal system, finding peaceful ways to resolve conflicts. These alternatives might not feel as satisfying in the moment, but they won't destroy your life or the lives of people you care about. The strongest person in any conflict is the one who has the courage to choose peace over violence, even when violence seems like the easier option. I wish someone had told me this when I was 19, but I was too proud and too angry to listen. Don't make the same mistake I did. To the parents and family members who are watching their loved ones get pulled into gang life or who are dealing with the aftermath of gang violence, I see you, I understand your pain, and I want you to know that healing is possible. The families who lost loved ones in the war I started taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what happened. It means choosing to break the cycle of hatred and revenge that perpetuates violence. Some of those families chose to work with me in the peace process. Not because they forgave me, but because they didn't want other families to experience the same loss. Their courage and wisdom saved countless lives and showed me what real strength looks like. If your family has been affected by gang violence, there are resources available to help you heal and to prevent future tragedies. Organizations like Mothers Against Gang Violence, community intervention programs, and victim services can provide support, counseling, and practical assistance for dealing with the aftermath of violence. Don't try to handle this alone. There are people who understand what you're going through and want to help. The ripple effects of the war I started are still being felt in Compton today, more than 20 years later. Children who grew up during the violence are now adults dealing with trauma. Families are still grieving loved ones who were killed, and the community is still working to rebuild the trust and social cohesion that was destroyed. But there are also positive ripple effects from the peace process and the work that has been done since then. Young people who might have joined gangs chose different paths. Conflicts that could have escalated into violence were resolved peacefully, and a new generation of community leaders emerged who were committed to preventing future wars. The peace agreement we reached became a model for conflict resolution in other communities, and the lessons learned from our experience have been used to prevent and end gang wars in cities across the country. The work I do now speaking to young people has reached thousands of individuals who have made different choices because they heard about the real consequences of gang violence. Every life saved, every family kept together, every community that avoids the kind of devastation that Compton experienced. Those are the positive ripples that can emerge from even the most tragic circumstances if people are willing to learn from their mistakes and work for change. The guilt I carry from starting that war will never completely go away, and I don't think it should. The memory of the people who died, the families that were destroyed, and the community that was terrorized serves as a constant reminder of why the work I do now is so important. But I've learned that guilt can be either destructive or constructive, depending on how you channel it. Destructive guilt leads to self-pity, substance abuse, and giving up on the possibility of positive change. Constructive guilt leads to action, service, and a commitment to preventing others from making the same mistakes. I chose the constructive path, not because I'm a particularly good person, but because I realized that wallowing in self-pity wouldn't bring back the people who died or heal the community that was damaged. The only way to honor their memory was to work as hard as I could to prevent future tragedies. That work has become my life's mission, and while it can never fully atone for what I did, it gives meaning to my survival and purpose to my existence. I survived the war I started for a reason, and that reason is to warn others about the true cost of pride and violence. The work I do now isn't just about preventing gang violence. It's about showing people that redemption is possible, that your worst mistakes don't have to define your entire life, and that even the most destructive actions can be transformed into positive change if you're willing to do the hard work of healing and growth. I can't bring back the people who died in the war I started, but I can work to ensure that their deaths weren't meaningless by preventing future tragedies. Every young person who chooses dialogue over violence, every conflict that gets resolved peacefully, every family that stays together instead of being torn apart by gang warfare, that's how I honor the memory of the people who died because of my pride and stupidity. The ripple effects of positive change are just as powerful as the ripple effects of violence, but they take longer to see and require more patience to cultivate. Change is possible, healing is possible, and redemption is possible, but only if we're willing to acknowledge our mistakes, take responsibility for our actions, and commit to doing better. That's the message I try to share with everyone I meet, and it's the lesson I learned from the most painful experience of my life. Before I finish my story, I need something from you. If this video has impacted you in any way, if it's made you think differently about gang violence, about the consequences of pride, about the importance of choosing peace over conflict, I need you to share it. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and most importantly, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a young person in your family who's struggling with anger and pride. Maybe it's a parent who's trying to understand the forces that pull young people into violence. Maybe it's a community leader who's looking for ways to address gang violence and promote peace. Your share could prevent a war. Your comment could reach someone who's about to make the same mistake I made. Your engagement helps this message reach more people who need to hear that there are alternatives to violence, that conflicts can be resolved peacefully, and that real strength comes from choosing peace over pride. Don't just watch this video and move on. Take action to help spread this message to people who need to hear it. I also want to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your thoughts, your experiences, your questions. Whether you agree with everything I've said or not, whether my story resonates with you or challenges you, I want to know. This conversation doesn't end when the video stops. It continues in the comments, in the discussions you have with your families, in the choices you make when faced with disrespect or conflict. So please, take a moment right now to engage with this content. Your voice matters, your story matters, and together we can create change that prevents future tragedies. Share your own experiences with conflict resolution. Tell me about times when you chose peace over violence, or ask questions about how to handle situations where you feel disrespected or threatened. The more we talk about these issues openly and honestly, the more we can help each other make better choices. Your comment could be the thing that helps someone else avoid making the same mistakes I made. To anyone watching this who is currently involved in gang life, who feels trapped by cycles of violence and retaliation, who thinks that backing down from a fight makes you weak, I want you to know that you have more power than you realize. You have the power to choose differently, to break cycles instead of perpetuating them, to be the person who stops the violence instead of escalating it. It takes more courage to walk away from a fight than to start one, more strength to choose peace than to choose war, more wisdom to think about consequences than to act on impulse. I was responsible for starting the deadliest war in Compton history, but I was also responsible for ending it. If I can find the courage to choose peace over pride, to work for healing instead of revenge, to use my experience to prevent violence instead of cause it, then so can you. The first step is believing that you deserve better than a life defined by violence and conflict. The second step is reaching out for help. There are people waiting to support you, communities ready to embrace you, and opportunities available that you might not even know exist. The third step is taking action, one day at a time, one choice at a time, one breath at a time. To the families who lost loved ones in the war I started, I know that no apology can bring back your sons, daughters, fathers, mothers, brothers and sisters. I know that my words can't heal the pain that my actions caused, and I know that some of you will never forgive me for what I did. That's your right, and I understand it completely. But I want you to know that not a day goes by that I don't think about the people who died because of my pride and stupidity. Their faces are with me when I wake up in the morning and when I go to sleep at night. Their memory drives everything I do now to prevent other families from experiencing the same loss. I can't undo what I did, but I can work to ensure that their deaths serve as a warning to others about the true cost of gang violence. Some of you chose to work with me in the peace process, and your courage and wisdom saved countless lives. Others chose to stay away, and I respect that decision completely. All I can do is continue the work of preventing future tragedies and hope that someday, in some small way, that work might bring meaning to the senseless loss of life that my actions caused. My name is Antonio, and I started the deadliest war in Compton history because I was too proud to let disrespect slide. Today, I choose to be known as someone who ended that war, who works to prevent gang violence, who believes in the power of peace and redemption. This is my story, my confession, and my warning. Pride will destroy everything you care about if you let it control your decisions. Violence creates more problems than it solves, and wars are easier to start than to stop. But there is hope, there are alternatives, and there is help available for anyone brave enough to choose peace over pride. If this video has impacted you, please don't just watch and move on. Like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Leave a comment telling me your thoughts, your story, or your questions. Your engagement helps this message reach more people, and your voice adds to the conversation that can save lives. Remember, every choice you make matters. Every moment of pride or humility shapes your future, and every person has the power to choose peace over violence. Thank you for listening, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of the solution. Stay strong, choose peace, and never let pride destroy what you love.